remote Minnesota boat launch before sunrise. A habituated black bear out of the fog at a dead run. A woman down on the gravel with a cut leg and a locked car. And a 12-gauge shotgun in the trunk she had to reach before the bear came back around. May 2012. Lake Superior shoreline, northern Minnesota. Helen Marsh, 63, a recently retired schoolteacher from Duluth, knew the fog came in heavy off the lake in late spring. She wanted to be on the water before the heat built. She arrived at the remote gravel launch before any other vehicles. At the far end of the lot stood a single green dumpster, unsealed, loaded with rotting fish carcasses and food waste accumulated over several days. The smell had spread across the clearing and into the tree line well before Helen pulled in. Helen kept a Mossberg 500 12-gauge in a padded case in her trunk, loaded with 3-inch Brenneke rifled slugs, a setup her brother had insisted on after a close encounter of his own on a portage trail 2 summers prior. She had fired it twice at a range, found it manageable, and had not thought much about it since. The case was under her kayak paddle and life jacket at the back of the trunk. She parked, killed the engine, and opened the trunk to retrieve her gear. Visibility ran 65 feet in any direction before the fog absorbed everything. A metallic clang came from the direction of the dumpster. She turned. A black bear, 300 pounds, adult male, came around the side of the container at speed, crossing the gravel in a direct line toward her. She stepped back. Her heel caught the concrete drainage lip at the gravel's edge, and she went down hard onto her back, the impact driving the breath from her lungs. Her left ankle registered a sharp, immediate pain. She did not get up. The bear reached the open trunk. It rose on its hind legs and pushed its head and forelimbs into the cargo space, snout working across the interior. Helen, on her back 4 feet away, could hear the wet, rhythmic pull of air through its nostrils. The animal dropped back to all fours and swatted at her legs. The claws opened her left shin through the hiking pants, 2 parallel cuts, blood spreading fast through the fabric. Helen's vision narrowed. She did not scream. She rolled onto her right side and pulled herself toward the rear bumper using her elbows, her left ankle dragging, bearing no weight. The bear circled to her left, claws clicking on the gravel. Helen reached the bumper and pulled herself upright on her right leg, both hands gripping the trunk lip. The Mossberg case was 18 inches away, partially pinned under the paddle. She shoved the paddle aside with her forearm, got both hands on the case zipper, and pulled it open. The bear was at the rear corner of the car, 6 feet away, head swinging toward her. She pulled the Mossberg free, got the stock to her shoulder, and drove the muzzle toward the bear's chest. Her hands were shaking badly. The bead sat somewhere on the animal's front mass. She fired. The slug, 1¼ ounces of lead at 1,500 feet per second, struck the bear in the sternum. The impact drove it back 2 full steps, its front legs splaying on the gravel. It dropped to its knees, both forelimbs folding under it, head going down. It tried to rise. The front legs pushed once, trembled, and gave out. Helen pumped the action and kept the muzzle on the animal's skull from 5 feet. The bear did not rise again. Its breathing, audible, wet, decelerating, stopped within 40 seconds. She sat down on the bumper with the shotgun across her lap and did not move until she heard a truck engine on the access road. Medical findings and aftermath. The fisherman who pulled into the lot found Helen on the bumper, shotgun in her lap, applying pressure to her shin with her life jacket. The lacerations required 14 stitches at a regional trauma center. Imaging confirmed a grade 2 sprain of the left ankle. She was discharged the same day. Physical recovery took 6 weeks. There was no lasting impairment. The bear was a confirmed adult male, 290 pounds on the wildlife officer's scale. Necropsy identified the slug entry wound in the sternum, with terminal fragmentation producing fatal damage to the cardiac and pulmonary structures. The animal showed signs of long-term food conditioning, smooth, worn teeth consistent with years of processed food consumption, and a body condition well above seasonal norms for the region. Minnesota DNR officials noted it would have met criteria for euthanasia regardless of the encounter's outcome. The unsealed dumpster was replaced with a bear-resistant unit within the week. Helen returned to the launch the following season. She moved the Mossberg to the rear passenger footwell, loaded, case unzipped. Incident analysis. Human mistakes. The unsealed dumpster at an unstaffed remote site was the concentrated attractant. A perimeter scan before exiting the vehicle would not have prevented the encounter, but would have kept Helen on her feet, which was the variable that nearly cost her access to the shotgun. Gear performance. The Mossberg 500 with rifled slugs was adequate for a 300-pound black bear at close range. A single center mass slug to the sternum produced fatal internal damage and immediate loss of locomotion. At 5 feet, the shaking hands and absence of a precise sight picture did not prevent an effective hit. The animal's frontal profile at that distance was wide enough to absorb the shot, even with significant muzzle movement. Effective actions. Keeping the shotgun in the trunk rather than a locked cab or separate vehicle was the decision that made retrieval possible while injured and on one leg. 2 additional seconds of access time, a locked case, a different storage position, likely changes the outcome. Practical takeaway. A long gun in a latched case under other gear is not a defensive tool. It is cargo. In bear-active remote sites, the shotgun or rifle needs to be the first thing your hands reach when the trunk opens, not the last. Stage it accordingly before you arrive, not after you need it. Helen's story proves that a 12-gauge is the great equalizer, but she had the luxury of a 300-pound target. What happens when the bear is 3 times that size and already has your son by the neck? Before we moved to the Wyoming wilderness, Helen used a 3-inch Brenneke slug. Some say Birdshot is enough for a warning. Looking at how fast that bear closed the gap, do you think a warning shot would have worked? Or is slug only the only way to live? Drop your comments down below. A Wyoming riverbank at first light, a 900-pound grizzly out of the willows, a teenage boy down on the gravel in the first 3 seconds, and a lever-action rifle that had ridden 5 days in a scabbard without being cycled until the moment it needed to work perfectly. June 2014, Snake River Corridor, northwestern Wyoming. Claire Holloway, 38, a landscape architect from Fort Collins, and her son Eli, 17, were breaking down camp on the final morning of a 5-day backcountry float trip. The site sat on a gravel bar backed by dense lodgepole pine. No sightlines into the timber, no margin for early warning. The river ran roughly 90 feet from the tents. Claire carried a Marlin 1895 guide gun in .45-70 government throughout the trip. A short-barreled lever action built specifically for close-quarters bear country work. She kept it leaning against the interior tent pole each night, within arm's reach of her sleeping bag. That morning, she had stepped outside without it, setting it against the tent frame while she rolled her pad. A food cooler sat partially unsealed near the dead fire pit. A trail mix bag hung from a branch at 6 feet, half the required minimum. Both had been releasing scent into the cool air for hours. Eli stepped out at first light to fill water bottles at the river. Claire heard his boots on the gravel, then silence, then a single sharp scream. She turned back through the tent door, grabbed the Marlin by the receiver, and came out at a run with it in one hand, working the lever as she cleared the opening. The round seated. The hammer was back. A mature male grizzly, wide-faced, slope-shouldered, heavy at 880 pounds by later estimate, had already crossed 90 feet of open ground and struck Eli with a lateral swipe that drove him sideways off his feet and threw him across the river rocks. He landed prone, one hand still gripping a water bottle. The bear dropped its chest weight onto his torso, forelimbs bracketing the boy's body on both sides, and targeted the back of his neck with its jaws. Claire covered the distance at a run. At 20 feet, she planted both feet, raised the marlin, and pressed her cheek to the stock. Her arms were shaking. The front bead tracked across the bear's skull and upper back in a pattern she could not fully arrest. She fired. The .45-70 round, a 405-grain hard-cast flat nose loaded to full pressure, struck the bear across the top of the left shoulder blade. The impact drove the animal's front left leg out from under it. It dropped that shoulder into the gravel, releasing Eli's neck for a fraction of a second, then pushed back up with a hard lateral swing of its head. Claire worked the lever without lowering the rifle. The spent case ejected off her right cheek. She closed the distance to 12 feet. The bear turned its head toward her. Its eyes tracked. It began to shift its weight off the boy. She put the second round through the base of the skull at a slight downward angle. The bear's hindquarters dropped first, both rear legs ceasing to function in a single, clean instant. The front legs held for 2 more seconds, the animal's full weight still partially on Eli, the jaw beginning to slacken. Then the muscle tone left the neck, and the bear's head came down hard onto the gravel beside the boy's shoulder. Claire levered a third round and held the muzzle 6 inches from the back of the skull for 4 seconds. The animal did not move. She did not fire the third round. She dropped to her knees beside Eli, her left hand on his back, feeling for the rise and fall of breathing. It was there, shallow, disrupted, present. He turned his head and looked at her. He did not speak. Medical findings and aftermath. Eli sustained deep lacerations across the upper back and left shoulder, 2 cracked ribs from compression loading, and a severe cervical strain. He did not sustain a spinal fracture. Claire activated the emergency satellite beacon within minutes of the attack. A search and rescue helicopter reached the gravel bar 3 hours later. Eli was airlifted to a regional trauma center and discharged after 4 days. He recovered full mobility within 8 weeks, retaining a set of parallel scars across the left shoulder that remained visible at the time of the investigating team's final interview. Claire sustained no physical injuries. Responding paramedics noted elevated heart rate, shallow respiration, and fine motor disruption consistent with an acute stress response. Both symptoms had resolved within 2 hours of helicopter arrival. Wildlife investigators confirmed the bear as a mature male, estimated at 880 pounds, consistent with prior reports of a large adult grizzly using that river corridor. Stomach contents included fish remains, berry seed mass, and fragments of wax paper consistent with processed trail food, sourced in all likelihood from the unsealed cooler at the camp. Incident analysis. Human mistakes. The unsealed cooler and the improperly hung food bag were the primary attractants. The hang height of 6 feet left the food effectively accessible to any standing bear. Either item alone was sufficient to redirect a large predator into the campsite at close range. Gear performance. The Marlin 1895 in .45-70 performed as designed. The first round at 20 feet disrupted the bear's forelimb structure and broke contact with Eli's neck. The second round, placed at the base of the skull from 12 feet, produced immediate and complete motor collapse. Shot placement at close range, not caliber alone, determined the outcome. A heavier or faster round would not have compensated for a miss. Effective actions. Keeping the rifle inside the tent rather than in a separate bag or vehicle was the decision that made it accessible in under 10 seconds. The satellite beacon produced a GPS-precise extraction point in a zone with no cellular coverage. Both tools were necessary. The rifle ended the attack. The beacon ended the isolation. Practical takeaway. A backcountry rifle does nothing leaning against a tree 30 feet away. In grizzly country, the distance between you and your long gun at the moment you need it is the only specification that matters. Keep it within arm's reach when you sleep, and on your back or in your hand when you move. Claire didn't have time to think. She only had time to cycle the lever. The 4570 government did its job, but it took a second round to the skull to seal the deal. But if you think a lever action is slow, imagine being trapped under a delivery van while a bear treats your cargo like a buffet. Now that you have heard this story, what would you have done differently? If you were in Claire's boots, would you trust that .45-70 lever action to stop 900 pounds of muscle? Or is a semi-auto the only thing that gives you peace of mind in the brush? A snow-covered delivery road in Russia's Far East. A 600-pound Ussuri brown bear out of the taiga at a purposeful run. A driver under his own vehicle for 8 minutes, and a Mosin Nagant rifle bolted to the cab wall that he had to go back into the open to reach. November 2007. Amur River Valley, far eastern Russia. Pavel Ivanov, 44, ran a weekly delivery route through second-growth taiga connecting rural settlements to a regional market 12 miles east. His van hauled smoked fish, dried meat, and grain sacks. Years of those loads had saturated the vehicle's metal floor slats and wooden crate frames with a scent no cleaning schedule touched. On a cold morning, with the rear doors open, the cargo smell carried a long distance downwind. Pavel kept a Mosin Nagant M91/30, a 7.62 by 54R bolt action, surplus military issue, mounted in a horizontal bracket bolted to the cab's rear wall behind the driver's seat. Standard equipment on rural delivery vehicles in the region, maintained out of habit as much as protocol. The rifle was loaded with 5 rounds of 180-grain soft-point hunting ammunition, a civilian modification of the standard military load. Reaching it required opening the driver's door, climbing up into the cab, and unclipping the barrel retention strap from the bracket. A fresh 2-inch layer of snow had settled overnight. Temperature sat at 30 degrees when Pavel pulled to his usual unloading point, a widened road shoulder near a field access track. He stepped out and bent over a metal crate at the van's rear, working the latches. He heard the snow compress in the tree line 50 feet to his left. The bear, a mature male, 600 pounds, heavy-necked, came out of the taiga at a walk that accelerated into a run over the final 20 feet. It went directly for the rear of the van. The impact when it hit the cargo doors rocked the suspension. Both doors swung open against their hinges, one folding back hard against the side panel with a sharp metallic crack. Pavel lost his footing on the snow-slicked surface and went down sideways beside the rear tires. The bear was above him, hindquarters and the underside of its torso visible as it reared onto the bumper and pushed its upper body into the cargo bay. He dropped flat and crawled forward beneath the vehicle, pulling himself under the front axle and pressing his back against the undercarriage. The snow beneath him was packed hard. The metal above pulled heat through his jacket immediately. The bear worked through the cargo for 8 minutes. Wooden crates cracked and splintered. Grain sacks tore open. Between the sounds of destruction, Pavel could hear the animals breathing. Slow, deep, rhythmic. Not agitated. At one point, the bear dropped back to all fours. One front paw came down 10 inches from Pavel's knee, the claws pressing into the snow with the full weight of the animal's foreleg. Pavel's breathing had gone rapid and shallow. He kept his eyes on the paw and did not move. The bear pushed back up into the cargo bay. 2 other vendors stood 100 feet up the road, shouting. The bear did not turn toward them. Pavel made the decision during the bear's second trip into the cargo bay. He had 2 options: wait for something else to drive the bear off, or reach the Mosin. Waiting had no guaranteed endpoint. The rifle was 15 feet away on the other side of the driver's door. He pulled himself out from under the front axle on the passenger side, away from the bear's position at the rear, and came up into a crouch behind the front wheel. The bear's hindquarters were visible above the bumper, its attention entirely inside the cargo space. Pavel moved to the driver's door, opened it in a single pull, and climbed up into the cab. His fingers found the barrel retention strap and unclipped it. He pulled the Mosin from the bracket, worked the bolt to confirm a round was chambered, and stepped back down onto the road. The bear was still in the cargo bay, its back to him, 18 feet away. He raised the rifle, put the front post on the base of the bear's skull where the neck met the shoulders, and fired. The 7.62 by 54R round entered the cervical spine at the atlas vertebra. The bear dropped straight down out of the cargo bay, its entire muscular system ceasing to function in a single instant. It landed in the snow behind the van's bumper and did not move. Pavel worked the bolt and held the muzzle on the animal's skull for a long moment. Then he lowered the rifle and leaned against the driver's door. The two vendors up the road did not move for several seconds. Then one of them began walking toward him across the snow.
Medical findings and aftermath. Pavel sustained deep bruising across the torso from his time pressed against the undercarriage, and superficial frost nip on his fingers and both cheeks from 8 minutes against packed snow at 30 degrees Fahrenheit. A local medical assistant treated him for shock and monitored the tissue damage. It resolved without complication within 2 weeks. The cargo was a near total loss. Every crate of smoked fish had been opened or destroyed. The grain sacks emptied across the road, and the van's rear cargo floor gouged along its full length. One door hinge had been partially torn from the frame. The bear was confirmed at 590 pounds. Necropsy identified the single round's placement at the Atlas axis junction as immediately fatal. Brainstem severance producing instantaneous motor collapse. Following the incident, Pavel relocated the Mosin bracket to a position accessible from outside the cab through the passenger window, a modification that reduced access time from approximately 25 seconds to under 10. He also began making his roadside stops with the driver's window already down. Incident analysis. Human mistakes. Staging high-scent cargo on an open roadside in a known bear corridor during pre-denning season was the primary error. The van's accumulated scent load made it a target regardless of any single day's cargo. Gear performance. The Mosin Nagant M91/30 with soft-point hunting ammunition performed adequately. The 7.62 by 54R cartridge, often dismissed as marginal for large bear, produced an immediately fatal result through precise placement. Shot placement at the base of the skull rendered caliber debate irrelevant. The rifle's primary limitation was positional. Its mounting location inside the cab added significant time and exposure to the retrieval sequence. Effective actions. Moving to the passenger side before exiting from under the vehicle kept Pavel out of the bear's sightline during the approach to the cab. The bear's exclusive food focus throughout the encounter gave him the time the retrieval required. Practical takeaway. A rifle mounted inside a locked cab is better than no rifle. It is not as good as a rifle that you can reach without climbing over a bear's position to get there. In a vehicle that regularly operates in bear country, the gun's mounting point should be evaluated for retrieval under pressure, not just for storage convenience. One shot, one cervical spine hit. The Mosin Nagant is a relic of the World Wars, but in the hands of a man with no other choice, it was a surgical tool. However, Pavel had 8 minutes to breathe. Our next survivor didn't even have 8 seconds. Pavel used a surplus Mosin. It's cheap, it's rugged, and it's effective. Is there a budget gun you'd trust your life with in the taiga, or is it high-end or nothing? Let me know your favorite working bush gun below. A remote Alaskan fish camp on a gravel beach in October fog. 70 pounds of curing salmon in the open air. A 1,000-pound Kodiak bear out of the driftwood at 30 feet. And one rifle leaning against a wooden rack that one man reached and one man did not. October 1999. Kodiak Archipelago coastline, southwestern Alaska. Thomas Renner, 52, and two relatives, his younger brother Daniel, 44, and their cousin Marcus, 38, had been running a subsistence fish camp on a narrow beach for nearly 2 weeks. The site was hemmed in on the landward side by stacked driftwood walls reaching 8 feet, which collapsed sight lines to under 20 feet in any direction except out to sea. The wooden drying racks at the center of camp held approximately 70 pounds of split salted salmon, dark, dense, the scent carrying far on the afternoon wind. Pre-denning season on the archipelago, coastal brown bears moving at maximum range, packing calories before freeze. Daniel kept a Remington 700 in .375 H&H Magnum as the camp's designated bear gun, a bolt action with a 24-inch barrel loaded with 300-grain soft points, selected for its ability to anchor large coastal browns at the ranges the terrain produced. That afternoon, it was leaning barrel up against the near leg of the main drying rack, 12 feet from where Thomas was kneeling on the gravel, breaking down the sleeping tent. The rifle was loaded. The bolt was closed on a live round. The safety was on. The Pacific fog had thickened to the point where the water's edge was barely visible from the center of camp. The Kodiak bear came around the end of the driftwood stack without a sound. Mature male, close to 1,000 pounds. It had covered the 30 feet between the driftwood and Thomas's position before any of the three men understood what they were seeing. Both forepaws drove down onto Thomas's upper back and shoulders. The impact carried enough force to drive his face and chest directly into the gravel. Thomas landed prone, arms partially pinned beneath him. The bear shifted its weight forward and targeted the neck and shoulder junction with its jaws. Daniel was 15 feet away, beside the fish racks. The Remington was 3 feet to his left. He reached it in 2 steps, pulled it from the rack post, and drove the bolt up and back to verify the round was seated. His hands were shaking. The bolt required 2 attempts to close cleanly. He raised the rifle toward the bear. The bear's skull was partially obscured by its own shoulder mass as it bore down on Thomas. Daniel's front sight sat on the animal's upper back, between the shoulder blades. Not the ideal placement, but the only clear target available. He fired. The .375 H&H round struck the bear in the upper dorsal region, passing through the trapezius muscle mass and impacting the spine at the T4 vertebra. The bear's rear legs dropped immediately, both hindquarters collapsing onto Thomas's lower body. The jaw grip released. The animal's head came up and swung toward Daniel, its front legs still functional, its forelimbs pushing against the gravel in an attempt to drag itself forward. Daniel worked the bolt. The second round chambered cleanly. He put it through the left side of the skull at 12 feet. The bear's front legs buckled together. Its full weight came down across Thomas's legs and lower back. It did not move again. Marcus had not moved during the shooting sequence. He stood at the far end of the rack, both arms at his sides, breathing in rapid, shallow cycles. He did not speak for approximately 2 minutes after the second shot. Thomas was still conscious. He was not able to move his legs.
Medical findings and aftermath. Daniel activated the satellite emergency beacon within minutes. A Coast Guard helicopter reached the site 3 hours later. Thomas was alive on arrival, but had sustained severe spinal trauma. The bear's initial impact had produced a T6 compression fracture, and the subsequent weight loading across his lower body had worsened the injury profile. He was airlifted to a facility in Kodiak and then transferred to Anchorage for surgical intervention. Thomas survived. He retained partial mobility in his left leg and full mobility in his right. He did not return to subsistence fishing. He walked with a cane from that point forward. Daniel sustained no physical injuries. Marcus sustained no physical injuries. Both men reported acute stress disorder symptoms in the weeks following the incident.
intrusive recall triggered by the smell of saltfish and the ambient sound of surf on gravel. Daniel returned to the archipelago the following season. Marcus did not. The bear was confirmed at 970 pounds by the responding wildlife officer. Necropsy identified the first-round spinal impact at T4 as the wound that ended the attack, with the second round producing rapid death through cranial trauma. Incident analysis. Human mistakes. Running a surface camp during peak pre-denning hyperphagia with 70 pounds of curing salmon staged inside a terrain choke point that eliminated early visual warning compressed every risk factor into a single location. The fog removed the remaining perimeter entirely. Gear performance. The Remington 700 in .375 H&H performed as required. The first round's spinal placement was not a precision shot. It was the best available angle under the circumstances. But it achieved the critical outcome, releasing Thomas and stopping the bear's forward mobility. The second round ended the encounter. Against an animal of this size and commitment, caliber selection was correct. A lighter round through the same placement might not have reached the spine. Effective actions. Daniel's decision to move to the rifle immediately, rather than throwing objects or shouting, was the decision that kept Thomas alive. The satellite beacon produced a rescue timeline that a remote coastal location would otherwise not have permitted. Practical takeaway. A camp rifle leaning against a rack post 12 feet away is accessible. A rifle locked in a case inside a tent is not. In active bear terrain, the gun needs to be staged at the point where the work is happening, not stored for convenience, but positioned for the 2 seconds you might actually have. A .375 H&H Magnum is a hammer, but even a hammer can fail if it doesn't hit the nail square. Daniel's first shot didn't kill, it anchored. It's a terrifying reminder that stopping power is a myth without spine or brain contact. But if you think 1,000 pounds is big, wait until we head to the high Arctic. That first spine shot turned a 1,000-pound freight train into a stationary target, but it didn't stop the fight. If you were Daniel, standing over a pinned Kodiak with 12 feet of gravel between you and a second charge, would you have the ice in your veins to cycle that bolt for a precision skull shot? Or is the .375 overkill for your neck of the woods? I want to know. What's the holy grail caliber you'd trust to stop a literal monster before it reaches your camp? Shout it out in the comments.
In the high Arctic, February is not a month. It is a siege. At the 78th parallel, the sun remains a memory hidden below the horizon. The world is a monochromatic void of deep indigos and skeletal whites, where the wind doesn't just blow, it scours. Lucas Yelm, 34, a veteran wildlife photographer, and Marta, 29, a field assistant with an elite background in high-latitude logistics, had established an outpost on the Barents Sea ice margin. Their mission was to document the winter movement of the pack ice. They were disciplined operators. Their camp was a masterclass in polar protocol. Fuel and food were cached 50 feet away in airtight, scent-proof containers. The tents were reinforced nylon, anchored into the ice with specialized screws. But there is a flaw in the human logic of the Arctic. We think in terms of attractants, like food or garbage. A polar bear in the leanest months of the year thinks in terms of calories and heat signatures. To a 1,200-pound predator, a nylon tent is not a shelter. It is a wrapper. The bear that emerged from the darkness was a mature male, a massive specimen nearing 1,200 pounds. It had been moving across the frozen surface with a silence that defied its physics. On the ice, a polar bear's paws act like massive, fur-padded snowshoes, dampening the crunch of frozen crystals. It did not huff or growl. It moved with the predatory economy of an animal that knew there was no prey nearby to alert. Inside the tents, the silence was absolute. broken only by the rhythmic hiss of the wind. Marta's Sacco 85 was positioned in her gear loft, a .338 Winchester Magnum, a caliber designed for the most dangerous game on Earth. It was loaded with 250-grain Nosler partitions. This wasn't a hobbyist's rifle. It was a life support system. At 3:15, the bear reached the first tent. It did not investigate. It simply struck. The sound Marta heard was not the rip of fabric, but the structural failure of physics. A single downward blow from the bear's forepaw, carrying thousands of foot-pounds of force, snapped the 10mm aluminum poles of Lucas's tent like dry kindling. Marta was awake instantly. The cold air hit her lungs like liquid lead as the thermal pocket of her camp was shattered. Through the thin walls of her own tent, she heard the terrifying sound of weight redistribution. She heard the ice creak as the bear adjusted its stance. Then, the most chilling sound of all, the heavy, rhythmic sliding of nylon against frozen ground. The bear had pinned Lucas through the collapsed tent and his sleeping bag. It hadn't bitten him yet. It was simply claiming the package. It began to drag Lucas toward the edge of the ice floe, a purposeful move to get the prey into the water where the bear has total tactical dominance. Marta did not hesitate. Her training took over a vacuum where fear should have been. She unzipped her bag, reached into the gear loft, and pulled the Sacco from its padded sleeve. She worked the bolt, a metallic clack slide that felt deafening in the Arctic night. She stepped out of her tent into -15 °F temperatures, wearing only her base layers. The shock to her system was violent. The wind instantly began stealing the heat from her skin, and as she gripped the steel trigger guard, her right index finger registered the contact as searing pain rather than pressure. 25 yards out, she saw it. A pale, hulking mass moving away across the ice, dragging a dark shape. She raised the rifle, pressing the freezing walnut stock against her cheek. Her hands were already losing fine motor control. The front bead tracked across the bear's rear. She had one clear shot before the bear reached the jumbled ice at the flow's edge. She fired. The .338 round, carrying over 3,800 foot-pounds of muzzle energy, struck the bear in the right hindquarter. The heavy Partition bullet smashed through muscle and impacted the pelvis. The bear's rear legs faltered. Not a full collapse, but a pronounced loss of drive. It released the sleeping bag. Marta worked the bolt again. Her right hand was becoming a club. Her fingers refused to bend. To compensate, she used her left palm against the bottom of the trigger guard to keep the rifle braced against her shoulder. She fired the second round using the side of her stiffened index finger. The second round entered behind the bear's left shoulder, shredding the cardiac structures. The 1,200-pound animal rolled onto its side. It raised its head once, exhaled a final plume of steam into the frozen air, and went still.
Medical findings and aftermath. Search and rescue reached the site 12 hours later. Lucas had survived, though he sustained a fractured clavicle, 2 broken ribs, and deep lacerations where the bear's claws had gripped him through the bag. Marta's victory came at a price. She sustained severe frostbite to 4 fingers and 2 toes. In the 2 minutes it took to end the attack and signal for help, the Arctic had claimed its tax. She required weeks of specialized wound care to avoid amputation. The necropsy of the 1,180-pound bear confirmed it was in hunting condition, lean, focused, and undeterred by non-food smells. It was a reminder that in the high Arctic, the human is the only prey available. Incident analysis. Physiological failure. At -15 °F, Marta experienced rapid vasoconstriction, turning her hands into clubs. This confirms that extreme cold destroys fine motor skills, making complex manual tasks nearly impossible. Tactical success. Storing the Sacco .338 Magnum inside the thermal envelope, the tent, was the X factor. Immediate accessibility neutralized the bear's tactical advantage before it reached the water. Mechanical debate. While semi-autos offer speed, bolt-action reliability is king in the Arctic. Marta's ability to manually cycle the action, despite her frostbite, ensured the weapon functioned where gas-operated systems often freeze or short-stroke. Practical takeaway. The survival of Lucas Yelm was not a matter of luck, but of positioning. Marta's decision to keep the rifle inside her tent, unencumbered by locks or distant storage, was the only variable that mattered. The incident also highlights the severe physical degradation caused by extreme cold. Bolt-action rifles, while often praised for their mechanical reliability, require fine motor skills that can vanish in seconds at -15 degrees Fahrenheit. Marta's ability to improvise her firing grip was the X factor that prevented a tragedy. In the Arctic, you do not rise to the occasion, you sink to the level of your training and your gear's accessibility. Marta faced the largest land predator on Earth in -15-degree weather. Her fingers were literally freezing to the steel, yet she improvised. She proved that your X factor isn't just your caliber, it's your ability to operate when your body is shutting down. Marta had to fire with a club for a hand due to the cold. This is the ultimate debate: bolt-action reliability versus semi-auto speed in extreme cold. If you're at the 78th parallel, which one are you grabbing? Tell me why in the comments.
A remote Alaskan law enforcement outpost in November fog. Several hundred pounds of confiscated game meat are in a wooden shed 30 feet from the door. A grizzly that came through the shed wall like it was cardboard, and two officers, one with the wrong ammunition and one racing to a gun safe, trying to stop it before it worked through the station walls as methodically as it had worked through everything else. November 2018, Interior, Alaska, a remote law enforcement outpost. Officers Dana Bennett, 41, and Carl Reynolds, 38, were midway through a paperwork shift when the shed registered its first impact. Outside, the temperature had dropped to 22 Fahrenheit degrees, and fog had cut visibility to under 30 feet. The tree line began less than 40 yards from the shed's rear wall. The shed held several hundred pounds of confiscated moose and caribou meat, staged there pending helicopter transport to a regional evidence facility. It had been sitting in a non-reinforced wooden structure in pre-denning season in one of the densest grizzly corridors in the state for 3 days. Dana kept a Remington 870 12 gauge in the patrol station's front closet, standard issue, loaded with 5 rounds of 2 3/4-inch Birdshot. It was the station's designated door gun, meant for warning shots and nuisance wildlife. Nobody had updated the load for the threat environment. The station's primary bear gun, a Browning BAR semi-automatic in .300 Winchester Magnum, loaded with 180-grain Nosler partitions, was locked in the gun safe in the back office. Carl carried the safe combination. Dana did not. Dana heard the first impacts, heavy, rhythmic blows against the exterior shed wall, and moved to the reinforced side window. A large grizzly was standing on its hind legs against the shed door, using its full body weight to work the upper hinge point, rocking the panel in its frame with each push. The door gave on the 4th cycle. The upper hinge pulled clean from the rotted frame. The lower hinge held for 2 seconds longer, then separated. The bear dropped to all fours, stepped over the fallen door, and began dragging a moose quarter into the yard. Reynolds moved to the porch and fired 2 blasts from the Remington into the air. The Birdshot dispersed in the fog and accomplished nothing measurable. The bear set the moose quarter down, turned toward the station steps, and came forward. Both officers stepped back through the main door and pulled it shut. Reynolds turned the multi-point lock. The door was steel-framed and outward opening, the one component of the outpost built to a standard the situation required. Carl moved immediately to the back office.
Dana heard the safe's combination dial, then the wrong numbers, then the dial reset. Carl's hands were shaking. He described entering the combination 3 times before the mechanism turned. The safe opened. He pulled the Browning BAR, checked the loaded magazine, 4 rounds seated, and chambered the first. Outside, the bear had returned to the shed and was dragging a second meat portion into the yard. Carl moved to the reinforced rear window. The Grizzly was 25 yards out in the yard, positioned broadside, its head down over the meat. He opened the window 6 inches and rested the BAR's forend on the sill. The bear raised its head at the sound of the window mechanism. Carl fired. The .300 Winchester Magnum round struck the bear behind the right shoulder, passing through both lung lobes. The bear lurched forward 2 steps, its front legs driving hard into the frozen ground. Then its hindquarters began to sink. It turned in a tight half circle, dragging its rear legs, and went down on its left side in the snow between the shed and the station. It raised its head once. Then it did not move. Carl kept the Browning on the animal through the window for 90 seconds. Dana was behind him, her breathing audible in the room. Neither of them spoke. The bear did not move.
Medical findings and aftermath. Both officers sustained minor soft tissue injuries, abrasions and bruising consistent with rapid movement through a confined space during the retreat inside. Neither required medical transport. The storage shed was a structural total loss. The station's south-facing exterior siding required full replacement. 3 window frames needed resetting. The confiscated meat was unrecoverable. The bear was confirmed at 680 pounds. Necropsy identified bilateral lung collapse from the single .300 Win Mag round as the cause of death. The time of death was estimated at under 3 minutes from the shot. The Birdshot from Reynolds Remington had produced no tissue contact with the animal at any point. Post-incident review flagged the station's shotgun load as inadequate for the threat environment it was stationed in, and the Remington was subsequently restaged with 3-inch Brenneke slugs. Both officers submitted transfer requests within the following months and were reassigned to urban postings before the next winter season. Neither cited the bear encounter specifically in their transfer documentation. The Outpost adopted a zero-tolerance perishable storage policy and installed a reinforced steel evidence locker at the perimeter. Incident analysis. Human mistakes. Storing several hundred pounds of raw game meat in a non-reinforced wooden shed during peak pre-denning season in a known grizzly corridor for a multi-day staging period was the procedural failure that produced the entire incident. The attractant volume and the container's structural rating were completely mismatched. Gear failures. The Remington 870 loaded with Birdshot was the wrong tool for the situation it was staged to address. Birdshot against a 680-pound grizzly at any practical distance produces no meaningful deterrent effect. The gun safe's combination lock, requiring fine motor control under acute stress, added critical time to the retrieval of the only adequate firearm on site. Effective actions. The steel main door held for the full duration of the siege and gave Carl the time he needed to reach the gun safe. The Browning BAR in .300 Win Mag, fired from a stabilized position through a window at 25 yards, produced a single-shot terminal result. Caliber, bullet construction, and shot placement were all correct. Practical takeaway. The load in a defensive firearm is not an administrative detail. Birdshot in a bear country shotgun is not a deterrent. It is a noisemaker with extra steps. Every long gun staged for defensive use in predator habitat needs to be loaded for the animal it might actually face, checked on the same schedule as any other safety equipment, and accessible without a combination lock between you and the threat. Birdshot against a grizzly is like throwing salt at a tank. It's a miracle the steel door held long enough for Carl to remember his safe combination. It leads us to the ultimate lesson of the day. A gun you can't reach, or a gun loaded with the wrong ammo, is just a paperweight. Can you imagine standing there with a face full of fog, hearing the wood of your shed splintering, only to realize your shotgun is loaded with birdshot? Carl and Dana survived on pure luck and a steel frame, but it begs the question, how many of you have a nuisance gun staged that wouldn't actually stop a real threat? Let's settle it in the comments. Are you a one gun for everything type of person? Or do you have a dedicated beast stopper ready to go? And honestly, how many of you could nail a gun-safe combination while a 700-pound bear was rattling your porch?
If you've loved these terrifying true stories so far, we need your help to keep sharing them and create new episodes every week. Please grab your phone, scan the QR code now, and tap the subscribe button that opens on your screen.